Alrighty, so Nick Fuentes and Ethan Ralph have been trending on Twitter every day for the past, 3 days. Maybe it's been the whole week. And I have not spoken on this because I thought it was just internet drama. I thought it was, okay, Ralph is getting in a fight with Nick Fuentes. That's not very interesting. But then I actually I finally clicked on it. One of their names. I forget who. It might have been Ralph's name I clicked on, and I said, okay, fine. Why has this been going on for 3 days? Why are people still talking about these two? And it turns out that Ralph is having a bit of a redemption arc. He's actually, I'm sure he's doing it for totally dishonest reasons, calling out Nick Fuentes and exposing, bringing to light his role in the January 6th PSYOP, which is something that I've known about for a long time. The Gray Zone, Max Blumenthal's organization, published an article written by Max's wife, Anya, completely detailing all of the evidence tying Nick to the feds, the evidence that Nick is compromised, that he is likely working for the feds, at least at some point, and has received special treatment from them. But since Max Blumenthal is the son of a big Clinton apparatchik and of course a Jew, this article and all of the evidence therefore presented in the article, even though it was not written by Max, it was written by his wife, who I believe is not Jewish. Neither of them are practicing Jews, but Max has got that Jewish blood. And the Groypers, they don't trust the Jewish blood. And so none of them really woke up to this evidence. But coming from Ethan Ralph, who, I don't know how, I guess they just, it really shows how much this sector of the internet hates Jews, that Ethan Ralph has more credibility to them than Max Blumenthal. I guess that just shows how dedicated you are as a Jew hater. If you will believe Ralph, you won't believe it when it's coming from Max Blumenthal's website. You won't believe it coming from him because he's a Jew, but you'll believe it coming from Ralph. Anyway, it's on video. You don't have to believe either of them. All either of these guys have done, and of course Anya, who actually wrote the article, though thankfully she doesn't reduce herself to going on podcasts about this stuff, because she seems like a nice person. I much rather see Max and Ralph be the attack dogs, because they're good at that. And so without getting any deeper into e-drama, the issue here is that on January the 6th, as we know, people were wrongly arrested, accused of seditious conspiracy, and of trying to overthrow the government, and these people were prosecuted as insurrectionists because they walked into a government building. They were waved in by the police, and then they stayed within the velvet ropes. And these hardened criminals are still in prison. They're still in jail, awaiting trial, a lot of them, and then some of them have been sentenced to, who knows, 20 years in prison, life in prison. But Nick Fuentes, who was at the Capitol on January 6th, he was not dumb enough to step inside. He got on a megaphone. Okay? We all know Ray Epps. I've talked about Ray Epps a lot. Ray Epps was the boomer fed who was shouting, telling people, we got to go into the Capitol, into the Capitol. And Baked Alaska, who was a close confidant of Nick Fuentes for quite some time, Baked Alaska was the one who caught Ray Epps on tape saying that, and he shouted him, no, you're a Fed, and that's where we got the term boomer Fed. It was from Baked Alaska. Nick Fuentes, on the next day, on January 6th itself, he was on the Capitol steps, or actually outside the barricades, but he was on the Capitol property with a megaphone shouting, hey, charge the barricades, go at them, ignore the cops, we got to get in there. Doing the exact same thing that Ray Epps was doing, although Ray Epps didn't have a megaphone. He was just whispering in the ears of his other agents, and then he went and they picked up the barricades, threw them to the side. But Nick Fuentes seemed to do more than Ray Epps on January 6th itself. And interestingly, Baked Alaska is no longer affiliated with Fuentes' organization. I don't know if this is related to that. I don't follow them. I heard that old Baked is no longer hanging around the cozy compound. And now Ralph, it seems Ralph was the last man standing of the big names associated with Fuentes, because you had Kanye, who seems to have pushed him to the side. You have, that was Nick's meal ticket, was Kanye West. Kanye does not seem real interested in working with him anymore now that his presidential campaign really didn't go anywhere, and that whole presidential campaign was Nick's brainchild. He was the brains behind Kanye. But anyway, Kanye's gone. Nick's butt buddy Jade McNeil, he kicked him out for getting a girlfriend. That made mainstream media news. That made mainstream headlines across America. White nationalist group split over second in command finally getting a girlfriend. Then they had the whole Ali Alexander scandal. I never talked about that on this channel. I don't even want to get into it. It was dark. He was apparently grooming Fuentes' young teenage fans. Boys, by the way, not girls. There are no girls associated with Fuentes' organization. That's a common thread you see throughout here. There are no women, and there is no love of women within the Fuentes movement. Fuentes, actually, I brought up Lyndon LaRouche. I can't remember why a couple days ago. Fuentes reminds me very much of a Lyndon LaRouche character. It's a similar personality cult. You could also make the same argument about Ayn Rand, but I don't think Ayn Rand was a product of intelligence like Lyndon LaRouche was, or as it appears Nick Fuentes is. But anyway, Ralph was Nick's, really, his last man standing. He was the last, not that I could say any of these guys are big names. You probably haven't heard of most of the people I just mentioned. But within Nick's organization, these were the big guys. And, Ralph was a bit of a latecomer because Ralph had to hit rock bottom, and then he went crawling to Nick Fuentes. Ethan Ralph was a constant presence on the internet, going back to the days of Gamergate, and even before that, but wasn't really relevant until Gamergate, and he really hasn't been relevant since, but he just lingers. He's been everywhere, and he hit rock bottom, and he went crawling to Nick, and he said, Nick, I'll be your best boy. Just please give me a chance. And so that's where he's been the last few years. And now he's left, and he's claiming that it is a principled stance, that he just can't stand by because Nick is responsible for so many of these January 6th victims being locked up, and that Nick essentially sold them out. And again, these are not new allegations. I've talked about them before on the channel, but this is now coming from people within Nick Fuentes' own organization. And so for many of the gripers, this is the first time they're hearing that they are essentially fed cattle. They are being groomed not just by Ali Alexander for gay sex, they're being groomed by potential federal agents. And I think that the circumstantial evidence is pretty overwhelming that Nick is a Fed. Because at a certain point you have to ask yourself, well, gee, if Nick was a Fed, what would he do differently? And that's when it really hits you, like, oh, maybe that's actually what he is. And so Nick's whole fan base, he's cultivating a fan base essentially of meat sacks that he can hand over to the feds for them to harvest, and essentially keep having new, so-called white nationalist terrorists to arrest, to persecute, and to throw in prison so that they can keep the idea of white nationalist terrorism being a threat alive. Remember, the government tells us the number one threat in this country to national security is white nationalist right-wing terrorism. And who is the only white nationalist voice that anyone can even think of? Who even, let alone being relevant, who just exists? The only guy out there is Nick Fuentes. And what's he doing? He's just on a stream on Rumble, calling for a holy war against Jews in which he intends to make the Jews die. And so, what does that sound like other than a call to arms for white nationalist terrorism? A problem that I say is a fake problem that doesn't exist. Apparently, the America First movement is the sole example. And so Nick, I think, relies on his strong cult of personality to keep his followers from being exposed to this, from really putting two and two together. Because, of course, he's going to spin this in the opposite way, saying, look, the feds are after the so-called people who they describe as white nationalist terrorists. They're talking about us. That means that we're the only people who are really a threat to them. See how he spins that? But I mean, it's a very strong emotional appeal. I mean, if you're taking flak, you're over the target. But to me, I look at it, and what I see is the FBI claiming we got to fight white nationalist terrorists, even though the vast majority of their enemies are people who clearly are not white nationalists. You know, I mean, when the FBI talks about white nationalist terrorists and people who are their enemy, they're actually referring to people like Max Blumenthal, you know, who you know, Nick regards as a Jew agent. And so they're referring to a very, very broad group. They're not just talking about Fuentes and his supporters. After all, who is it they're arresting? They're not arresting the Fuentes movement. They have not shut down, you know, America First, whatever, 501c3 for being a terrorist organization. They haven't done any of that. Nick has not been arrested with respect to January 6th. All these other people who had almost nothing to do with January 6th, you know, other than the fact that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but people who wanted nothing to do with you know, overthrowing the government, you know, quite the opposite. I mean, boomer cons love America. They love the United States. And when they think of the United States, they mean the government. They really mean that. They believe that, you know, all this stuff, they believe that it is sacred. And so that's the last thing that the boomer cons were after on January 6th. Yet the likes of Ray Epps and Fuentes, they go free. And so what Ralph is accusing Fuentes of here, like I said, nothing new, is honeypotting all of his supporters who currently are affiliated with him. Just like he honeypotted those folks on January 6th. The crowd of people who, you know, I'm sure the vast majority of the people in the January 6th crowd outside the Capitol had no idea who Nick was. They just heard a guy on a microphone saying, "Charge the barricades." And, you know, again, it's hilarious that it's taking Ethan Ralph to really hammer this message home because, I mean, he's a doxer. He's a dirtbag. He's much worse than a doxer. He's a whole lot of other things, too. But, I mean, he's still not a good guy. I was being a bit tongue-in-cheek earlier when I said, Ethan Ralph's having a bit of a redemption arc. No, he's still Ralph. And he does destroy everything he touches, which I think, potentially, could apply to Nick here. I mean, I can't say I didn't see this coming. When Nick brought Ethan Ralph into his organization, I thought, gee, there's no way this ends well. And here we are. Ralph is going scorched earth. He has declared an A-log amnesty. And A-logs would be, people like me. Because he says it's all hands on deck. Everyone is now an ally. We must take down Nick Fuentes. A man who, according to Kanye West, I mean, he was proclaimed to be, the future president of the United States. So this is a very serious fellow, this Nick Fuentes character. Oh, and I didn't mention it, but all of this really came to a head on a fellow named Leafy's stream. And I've heard of Leafy. I don't think he's anyone who's relevant. I looked at his follower count on his current account. I assume he got banned or something before, because I thought this was someone who had like millions of subscribers at one point on YouTube, and I think he's only on Rumble now, and he's got like 10,000 followers. But he added nothing really to this conversation. He did a terrible job moderating it. I will try and link to his stream if you're interested in listening. And anyway, I think that this story has potential. It has potential legs. I think that, remember, Ray Epps is a nobody. He's still a nobody. There was a big story, all this, when it came out about him provoking the crowd. And I don't know why Fuentes hasn't gotten the same amount of attention, because he's a much more prominent figure. You know, Epps, someone who had literally zero following. He was, he was the state chapter president of the Oath Keepers for Arizona, and Arizona, I think, was the biggest state for the Oath Keepers. And anyway, there's a lot of Ray Epps. There's a lot to Ray Epps' history, but anyway, he was not someone who online was well known, and so I think Nick's prominence, to the extent that he has any, but people had heard of him before. Some people, not most people, but people who are very, very online and have been for years, they know Nick's name. If the story starts to gain traction that he was a Fed working for them on January 6th, trying to entrap people, that's going to become a mainstream story. And it won't be something that he's going to be able to escape. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.